So I drew names out of a hat to see who would introduce themselves first. You'll have to trust me on that. And Rebecca.
All right. Well, I'll get started then. Are we ready to start at 7 o'clock?
Want to be on.
It's 7 o'clock.
I don't want to show
All right. I love a person to start the meeting on time. Well, thank you everybody for showing up. And I think Pat and Dave and I are all happy to be able to come and join you and have a conversation. And we all believe strongly that one of the powers of debates is getting ideas out and making clear that there are other options for the state than what we see happening right now at the state level. And, you know, I just want to take this moment to honor the fact that all across the state in my conversations in the last couple of weeks, what I've been hearing is from families who are worried. They're worried about whether they're going to feed their kids. I've spoken to seniors who are worried about whether they'll be able to hold on to their homes. I've spoken to people who are worried about, as a state, how we can be really clear on our values in the next couple months and over the next couple years in ways that make sure that we're all showing up to keep each other safe. And that's about making sure people have food, they have housing, that they have the health care that they need to keep safe, and that we're working to get them back to work and doing this all as we plan for a good future. And I have to add to this list, because I've been speaking to educators, we have to ask not what schools can do to keep us safe, but what we're doing as communities to keep our schools safe, because they can't be open and safe if we aren't doing everything we can as individuals to protect them and make sure that COVID-19 is not coming back, particularly as we open them up in every part of the state, as the governor is trying to propose. We also need to ask, what are we doing? And you know, it was powerful to hear at the Democratic meeting last night, or last Sunday, not why so many people who are people of color aren't running, but what are we doing as white Vermonters to make sure that they can run? And when they are exposed to the kind of racism that I know Pat and David and I have seen on the trail, what are we doing to stand up and be with them so that they feel safe throwing up their hands and being part of the leadership of our communities? And I know that this is an issue that has been of incredible importance to the voters I've spoken to in Bennington recently. And we need to ask, what are we doing to clean up our water and to keep our air clean, to make sure that we have a bright future? And we need to be thinking about recovery, about how, as we turn to moving beyond keeping people safe in this current moment of crisis, how are we acting in ways that are laying the tracks for future sustainability, for making sure that the children that we care about, for our neighbors, that they know that there's bright economic opportunity after COVID-19. We need to be thinking about how we use every dollar for more than one purpose and use it as well as we can, so that when we come out of COVID-19, we're coming out stronger than we went into it. And we know it's going to be hard, but I had the incredible privilege, and I did not know what a privilege it would be until I began to run for governor, to meet people all across the state and to hear their bright ideas and to hear how deeply and passionately we care about the state and our future, but also how we care about each other. And so as your governor, I will not let you down. And I know people are worried, but I really look forward to working with you to create the bright future our state needs. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Pat, you are second.
Are we muted?
Well, I'd like to welcome Rebecca and David to Bennington County. You know, we've, I guess, my first speech was at the Bennington County Democratic meeting. Tom was there and was the chair at the time. Vicki Lamprin was there. You know, Sarah Perrin was there. There are a number of other people there. Nice for everybody to be there. You know, I am from Bennington, and I'm proud to be from Bennington. I am, you know, my office is on Main Street, right across from where Joey Culkin is at. And we're Main Street lawyers at Winburn Law Offices. We represent the powerless against the powerful. And we've been in Bennington County for 34 years. And always happy to see everybody. If anybody wants to stop by and say hello at 409 Main Street at my office, I'm happy to do that. We're, you know, Benningtonians are proud of our area, but unfortunately, as Dick Sears says, we're sort of the lost frontier down here. And we don't get treated the same as other areas in Vermont, and we don't get the same resources that other people do in other areas of Vermont. Chittenden County is a booming place, and I'm sure it'd be nice to have our economy booming, but that doesn't seem to happen. We sort of end up on the short end of the stick in Bennington and the county. And that's my intention to change that. I'd like to be the 7th governor of Bennington, and I think we can do a lot of good things for Bennington and elsewhere. We have a lot of good projects in Bennington. The Putnam Hotel renovation that's going on. I think it's going to be a major boon to the economy. And I think Bennington's going to be one of the places to watch in the future. Bennington is up and coming, and I want to help Bennington as your governor become, move into the 21st century. And I'm not sure that we've been there for a really long time. And so, welcome to David and to Rebecca, and I think we'll have a good debate and a good forum.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor.
Well, thank you everybody for having us, and Pat, that was a nice welcome. I do appreciate it. I've certainly been down to Bennington many, many times. And I also want to thank all of you in Bennington for the close relationship we have with August 16th, Bennington Battle Day. It's also my birthday, so I've always had fun talking about that with respect to the importance of that day to Vermont and that unique holiday to Vermont. It's been a real pleasure to serve you. I've been a legislator for 18 years and then lieutenant governor the last 4. And Bennington's always been a strong county, and I really appreciate that. And really want to just talk a little bit about some of the work I've done, as well as really the vision for Vermont. And so one of the issues many issues I've worked on over the years around progressive school funding, marriage equality, GMO labeling was an issue I worked on and traveled down to Bennington to meet with folks almost 20 years ago to talk about. Raise the minimum wage, which many of you know is a real issue for a lot of struggling Vermonters. Our criminal justice reform issues, the climate crisis mitigation issue, which I've been working on for actually a couple of decades now, and we need to continue to do more on. And of course, economic development, which I think is a really big issue for the southern counties. And I think, Pat, you touched on the challenge for some of the southern counties to get attention from Montpelier. If we really expand broadband, I think there's a huge potential for good paying jobs in southern Vermont with clients in Boston and New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. And so if we invest properly, we have real opportunity to help southern Vermont grow rather than be shrinking population counties in the state. And so, Pat, I couldn't agree with you more on the bright future if we put some resources in. As a farmer, a small business owner, I know what it takes to work day to day to build a business, pay employees, figure out how to produce a product that people need and want. And in farming, you really invest in your future. You're planting seeds, watering them, nurturing them, but you can also see the work get just destroyed by either a climatic issue or pests. It's very similar to what happens in politics. Sometimes you work on issues for a long time and you think you're just about there, and the rug gets pulled out from under you. In fact, with Vermonters, we passed the GMO labeling law, and then Washington, after $120 million of lobbying, took it away. But really, what's going on now? We've got the COVID crisis, and it's really hit working class Vermonters incredibly hard. We have to continue to invest in working Vermonters. We need to help create ideas like the Eat Every Day that came out of the legislature this year with CARES money, to give money to restaurants, to employ Vermonters, to then also buy food from local farms and create 18,500 meals a week for Vermonters through December. We need creative ideas to build our economy through this COVID crisis and rebuild ourselves stronger. And I got engaged in this campaign for multiple reasons, but the top 2 are because of economic injustice and the real challenge that Vermonters are facing economically, and the climate crisis. And now we've got 2 more huge issues, the COVID crisis, obviously, and the racial injustice issues that have been going on for centuries really coming to the fore. And I'm excited to take those issues on and serve as your governor. So thank you for the time.
Thank you. I think we'll continue talking since Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman brought it up, the economy. I have a question here from a small business owner in Bennington. Says, what I'm very concerned with is the survival of our small business, particularly between January and May of 2021. When COVID hit this year, it was during our slow time, so many of us had our survival money that was squirreled away during the previous year to see us through January to May. There is only a fraction of business happening now, and with the onset of cold and flu season coming, who knows what that'll do to decrease business further. There won't be any money in our coffers to get us through from next January till May. The business we're doing now is barely paying to keep the doors open, if that. I'd like to know what the candidates would do in their first 100 days to help small mom and pop businesses. Rebecca, I think we'll just go the same order. Is that okay with you guys?
Happy to go first. I think it's helpful to rotate, actually, if you think about that as you go through, but I'm happy to go first.
Yeah,
I don't know the sector. I can tell you that I'm a co-owner of a small inn in the Northeast Kingdom, and we had a very similar situation. We were in shutdown when COVID, it was our hump season when COVID hit. And, it's tough. I mean, the hospitality and recreation sector was one of the first to go. And even if we open up, technically, the reality is many people are going to be afraid to travel for some time. So many industries are looking at revenue shortfalls and wondering how they're going to make it through, particularly once the federal supports start to run out. And I think that there are multiple solutions for this. And I think the first is we need to be making sure that we are helping people find ways to access markets and access opportunity in any way they can be. And as Pat and David have already mentioned, broadband is a huge piece of this. When I've spoken to restaurant owners in different parts of the state, for example, what they need is some base of stable revenue so they can even afford to open their doors. If you open up and you've 100% of the cost, but you only have 25% of the revenue because of limits on how many you can serve, you actually lose more money by opening up. And so, the important thing we need to be thinking about is how to make sure that we have good access to basic broadband so people can start to rethink their business models in ways that can guarantee some access to revenue in the transition. And when I spoke to an epidemiologist, Nina Pfeffernan, back in March, what she said is instead of using government agencies or the federal government to do food distribution, for example, what are some ways that we can work with local business owners, whether it's through mutual aid societies or through engaging them in ways that engage them in some of the production and distribution of food to maintain some base of revenues? How do we make sure they have good broadband so that they can bring some of their business online and access in a ready-to-go format so that they can begin to find access to new markets or people who maybe want to pick up food but won't come in and sit down? So I think what we're going to have to do in every sector is make sure we've got the basic infrastructure in place and enough money continuing to circulate in our economy because of government purchasing or support for families so that we can continue to create new opportunities for these businesses as we go forward. And then the other thing we'll have to do is look at how we diversify our economy, because we need to be having other opportunities, including in green energy and green energy transitions, advanced manufacturing, some of the other sectors that are a little more immune to the COVID downturn, so that if we can bring in revenues in those other high growth, high wage, high opportunity sectors, we can find ways to create some revenues that offset some of the challenges. So those are just a beginning, but we're going to have hard questions across all sectors about how we make sure our mom and pop shops are okay.
Mr. Winberg.
Well, I have a personal, a stake in downtown Bennington. I run a mom and pop law office. My wife, Kim, and I have had a law office since 1987 in Bennington County, and it's a hard thing. I think the COVID crisis has been devastating all over the state to the local businesses. I know that restaurant across the street struggled to stay open. Some of the restaurants have closed down. There are pizza places that do takeout. We have some, other restaurants, but it's just had a disastrous effect on local business. But, one of the bright things in our future, and I'd mentioned it before, is the Putnam Hotel project. I think the Putnam project is going to revitalize the downtown of Bennington. And, it's sort of the reverse broken window theory, that if you have a broken window, then the whole neighborhood goes down. It's in reverse. They're fixing the windows, and they're making the Putnam Hotel building and the adjacent buildings just look great. I mean, they've left the facade, the outside part of the buildings, and they're totally gutted the interior portions of the building. But from my understanding, they've already rented out and sold some of them. They've condominiumized some of the units inside of the buildings, and I think that's going to revitalize the economy of downtown. But throughout the state, we need to everybody's economy needs to be brought up to the 21st century standards. And there, because of the corona crisis, we're going to have state and federal funding that's going to be available. Congressman Welch and Senator Sanders and Senator Leahy have already helped pass bills that are going to pump some money into the local economies throughout the state. And I think that that's important. But also, too, we need to remember that, that all the businesses in Bennington and in Vermont, they're not, they're not just offices, professional offices, but I know that Dane Whitman, works in gardening and landscaping, and there are a lot of people that have small businesses that have also been affected. And I think that if we are smart about it, we can help the local economy throughout the state, and we can make everybody happy and prosperous into the future. And that's my intention, and that's what I would do during the first 100 days, is to help Vermont become happy, prosperous, and strong, because we are a brave little state.
Lieutenant Governor?
Well, thank you. And Pat, thanks for bringing it back to the 100 days. I think that was the focus of the question, is what can we do immediately? Now, I really appreciated that the governor this spring, 2 days after I made the suggestion to the Department of Labor, finally said, we've got to get money into people's pockets. The folks that are on unemployment, who were waiting 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks through phone lines that they couldn't get through, we finally said, let's get the money out to people, put money in people's hands so that they can feed themselves. And in this case, they would also be able to then go to those local stores, go to some of those local restaurants, now that we have more takeout and more options, to put the money churning in the economy for multiplier effects. As I said in my opening, the legislature this summer just passed COVID relief funding for Everybody Eats, which is exactly that kind of program where the state supplies resources to restaurants. The restaurants are going to pay their employees. They're going to buy some of the food from local farms, and they're going to produce meals for struggling Vermonters. What I would do even before the first 100 days, right after elected in November, is I would start to work with the federal delegation and our new president-to-be, Joe Biden, to make sure that the HEROES Act, if Congress and McConnell and Trump won't get it through now, gets through the Congress. Because there's no doubt the state, we won't be able to do all the things that my two cohort here wanted to do in those first 100 days if there isn't the resources to do it. So either we have to get the federal government and work with our delegation, and as I wish our governor would do more, push McConnell and Trump to do it now, to get that money and resources freed up for us to get resources into Vermonters' hands, both to take care of themselves and to buy from local businesses. Vermont doesn't have enough money to just bail out every business. But if the federal government isn't going to do that, I then would take the resources that I had been talking about for investing in our in our economic infrastructure, broadband, affordable housing, weatherization, through a progressive taxation model on the top 5% of Vermonters to get some of the resources to help our businesses through the difficult times. Because if we lose too many businesses and too many people lose their jobs, then we are in deep trouble in Vermont, and we have to infuse money into the economy to make sure we don't lose all these businesses.
Thank you. We'll start with Pat Winburn on this next one. What is your vision for making Vermont a place that is more attractive for people of color to visit and relocate here? We have fewer young people and less diversity here than almost any state. How can we change that to create a Vermont that looks more like the rest of the country?
Well, I think that we need to, have more diverse citizenship. My daughter Sunrise is my campaign manager, and she lives in Brooklyn, but she has moved to Vermont and is now a resident of Vermont to run my campaign. And she grew up in Manchester and went to Burton. But she, tells me that the reason that that young people don't come to Vermont is because Vermont appears to be, mostly white people. That we need to have more diversity, and that it's in order to attract younger people, that we need to have an economy that's appealing to younger people, but also to have a culture of tolerance, and to be more appealing to a diverse population. In Vermont, we have diversity, and we have but we don't have enough diversity. And I think that when we go into the schools, and we can have more education about Martin Luther King, about people of color, and respect for justice and equality in the state. I think the state will be better for it. When I was in law school, my first job was to work at legal services, and one of the clients that we had, we sued Burger King, and she was a person of color, but she's also a woman, and we brought a class action lawsuit alleging race discrimination and discrimination against sex, and we were successful. And I think that what we need is equality and opportunity, and I think that in Vermont we can have that, and that's what I would do as governor.
Lieutenant Governor?
Well, thank you. I think it's really important that we both discuss the direct issues relating to our BIPOC community and the broader issues that everybody wants. Because sometimes it's actually almost racist to say, we need this specifically to attract Black, Brown, and Indigenous people to Vermont. What we really need to do is make an economy and a state that is welcoming for everyone, a state that's got affordable housing, a state that's got jobs that people can take, that they can raise their families on. And we need to address issues of systemic racism and white supremacy, whether it's in our education system, where we still, unfortunately, have disproportionate rates of our Black and Brown brothers and sisters getting detentions and suspensions. And I know the Secretary worked on that some as Secretary of Education, but we need to do more. We've got to work, on issues around racism and disproportionate policing and incarceration. We need to have a vision in the governor's office that takes on these issues so that people who look to Vermont and think about moving here see that the state's leadership is one that's inclusionary, that really is discussing these issues from day one, that has includes people in the administration, communities of color, so that the issues that folks are needing to address are addressed from the beginning of the conversation, not as an afterthought. If we have a progressive leadership on the climate, That's an area where young people across all races are extremely concerned because it's their future. It's our ability to grow food, it's ability to have kids and a healthy planet, and so forth. So it is a situation where we have to tackle it both head on and talk about white supremacy and racism, and we have to address underlying economic opportunities for young people who really can't afford to move here with the price of housing because we're in the New England marketplace. And then finally, I think we could do more with our state colleges, which right now we had a governor that was ready to let 3 of our state colleges close. And if we let those close, not only will it devastate the northern part of the state's economy, but will actually reduce the opportunity for young people to move to Vermont, get a good education in fields that we have jobs in, and then stay. And so we've got a range of topics we need to address.
Ms. Holcomb?
Thank you so much. And first of all, I just want to pick up on a point that David made earlier, in part because I think it's a really important point about why we need change in November. And that was with respect to the unemployment insurance checks. People should have known the day we closed down the economy that we were going to have a crisis with our unemployment insurance system. And we know that the administration, the Scott administration, spent $10 million on a new system and got nothing for it. In the same period, Gina Raimondo, a competent governor in Rhode Island, put a cloud-based system together in 10 days that served 70,000 people on its first day of operation. We have to expect more of state government because Vermonters deserve more. That's the difference between a governor who's going to lead and anticipate and a governor who's sitting there waiting for things to happen to him, which is what we have right now. And I just think that's a really important point. On this issue of race, you know, I've had multiple conversations with members of your community about it. And there are 2 points that really stuck out to me. One was in a recent study of policing, we learned that up to 20% of people in the community don't feel safe. And when 1 in 5 of our community members don't feel public safety is keeping their public safe, what we have is a crisis of confidence. And that's something that we need to, particularly as white Vermonters, own to try to understand why the experience of living in our communities is so different for people of color. The other thing I heard was when talking to somebody about why there weren't more candidates of color coming forward to lead, was that people are afraid because they know that when they throw their hand up and run for office, they are often subjected to kinds of harassment and racism that make them worry for their own safety and for the safety of their families. And as one of them said to someone I was talking with, can you promise me that if I run, I'll be safe? And this other person who'd been involved with government said, no, I can't. And that's the thing that hurts us from being a place where families feel they can live. And that's really about white people deciding that we want to stand up for our neighbors in ways that make sure that when they take risks and when they are leaders and when they're contributing to our communities, we're there with them, making sure that they're safe. As Secretary of Education, equity was a strong priority, and we moved a long way, and we had a long way to move. But we learned several powerful lessons that I will take with me as governor to this state. And the first is it's very hard to fix what you can't see. And the nature of bias is that we often can't see where the discrimination is unless we take the time to count. So one of the things that we did systematically, and you'll see this in all the data coming out of the education agency by the end of my tenure, was that we worked to collect data that would speak to the equity of opportunity and equity of access of every single state initiative that we reported on. So we broke it out. If you were looking at dual enrollment, we looked at how different communities were participating in that. Discipline, we started to publish data on disproportionality. In fact, some of the worst disproportionality in the state affects students with disabilities and students who are economically disadvantaged as well. So there are many communities that we have to worry about. But that's only the first step. We also work with the Human Rights Commission to train everybody in the agency in anti-bias, implicit bias, so that they could be mindful of some of the ways in which our assumptions may interfere with our ability to truly serve our public. We also worked hard to have an equity template that we applied to every proposal that came out of the legislature, because we learned that rules that seem and laws that seem neutral to race on their face can sometimes be incredibly disproportionate or biased in impact. And we see that in healthcare, we see that in housing, we see that in criminal justice, we see it in almost every sector. And if we are intentional about anticipating, we can make some of the difference. But 2 of the most important things that we learned is we need to begin promoting and attracting talent so that people of color are represented in state government, so that government truly is of the people, by the people, for the people. Because if young Vermonters of color don't see leaders in their communities who are people of color, they don't know that this community is representative of them. And that will be a strong commitment of mine. And the other thing we need to do is make sure, because public service is about service to the public, that we consult all the public when we make laws or put out new proposals and initiatives. So, for example, when we had to implement what was affirmative federal legislation to address historical inequities, we made sure to include our marginalized communities in the decisions about how that aid would be provided. Because if it isn't helpful to them, it isn't actually service. And I was very proud that in the context of some of this federal legislation, we got independent input from over 2,500 Vermonters in every community in the state and across all of our historically marginalized communities. And that's the kind of leadership I'll bring to Vermont, because I know when we work together to make sure everybody has a fair chance, we're all better off because we get the best and the most potential out of everybody. And they all deserve that same chance.
Okay, Lieutenant Governor, we'll go for you on this one. Are you aware of the benefits cliff? And do you have any ideas for addressing it?
Yeah, the benefits cliff, for those that don't know, because I don't know if all the viewers are familiar with it, but as folks who are getting state support services, whether it's for childcare, food supports, housing supports, healthcare supports, as one starts to increase your income, there's a point where if you increase your income, you actually lose more in benefits than you gain by gaining income. And so there's a real concern both for individuals who are in work, and I've heard from folks who say, my boss offered me an increase and I asked them not to give it to me because I'd be worse off with it. And for employers, it's difficult because you want to give more hours to a good employee and they say, no, thank you, because I'm gonna lose my overall economic well-being by working more hours. So to address it, my understanding is it's about a $20 to $40 million hole that is needed to be filled in order to make it so that people don't start to drop off in their income when they make more. Sorry if it's a little bit wonky. But we don't have $40 million right now. In fact, we're all struggling to find enough money to keep the businesses going that are out there. But we do need to look at each of those different supports. And it's really a challenging issue because often when the state supports something like Medicare with $1 or $2, the federal government matches that with more resources. So if we cut state funding, we actually lose multiple dollars for each dollar we cut in terms of Vermont's state economy and for those individuals. So to address it, we do need to find resources so that that drop off doesn't occur, and it's always a level increase for people as they get paid more for their work or more hours. I think one of the ways to address this is once we do build our way out of this economy and invest in the fundamentals of our economic system, whether it's broadband, affordable housing, childcare, weatherization, both for jobs, the climate, and to save working people money. As the state ends up with more resources, then we can start to address the cliff. Because unfortunately, the way most people would do it in office would be to cut those programs at the top and really hurt working Vermonters, and we cannot do that.
Unmute myself. Ms. Holcomb, would you like to go next?
I think this just speaks again to the need for a governor who has strong executive experience and the discipline and focus to get the job done. We actually have several benefits cliffs. It's not just at the low end. We also have a benefit cliff at the top end where if you earn even $100 too much, you face an $11,000 penalty when you lose access to subsidies at Vermont Health Exchange. And unfortunately, some people have access to good lawyers who help them avoid it, but many Vermonters don't. And that can be a terrible surprise for somebody. So, what we need is somebody who is willing to do the hard work of creating the graduated transitions and who is really invested in making sure that we are working in ways that make it possible for working families that earn between $50,000 to $80,000, for them to be able to work here, be safe, good health care they can afford, access to a good childcare so that they can go to work and not worry. And that just takes focus. It takes someone who's willing to work through the details to get the job done, because Vermonters deserve better.
Mr. Winburn.
Well, there really shouldn't be a benefits cliff, but unfortunately there is. That's why we need to have what I have proposed as a reshuffling of the deck. If you go onto my website at winburn2020.com, you'll see that there's a short video talking about reshuffling the deck. All of us were dealt cards in the 20th century, or our families were. And in the 20th century, things were different. And people in the 21st century now have to deal with the ramifications of the cards that they were dealt with back in the 20th century. So what my proposal is to reshuffle the deck. And then you turn the cards over and you throw out a few jokers, and then you start with new programs that can be debated and can be talked about in the legislature, and some of them have been. But I think the important thing is that we, after we reshuffle the deck, that we put the pedal to the metal and we get the job done, because people have to have a decent living wage. We also need a $15 an hour minimum wage. We also need family leave. And those are all things that I would do as governor in the first portion of my first time in office. We have to cherish the past. That's why a lot of people love Vermont, but we also have to move into the 21st century. And that's what I would do as governor.
Thank you. I'll just remind everyone one more time, let's try to keep our answers as concise as possible so that we can get through these. It's difficult, I know, for Mr. Winburn to see me signal, so I'm afraid I may have to shout over you.
Okay.
If it comes to that. Hopefully not. Let's start with Ms. Holcomb on this one. Where do you stand on the mandating of face coverings in stores and public places? And if you are in favor, how should this be enforced?
All right, had to unmute myself. Absolutely. We need to mask up to open up. And I just want us all to reflect on where we are right now. We are about to ask our schools to open up statewide in every community in the state, including child cares as well. And here's the problem. The minute they open, if there is COVID-19 in our communities, we're all of a sudden increasing dramatically the risk of spread. We all need to be doing everything we can to mitigate that risk, and that means we need to be wearing masks. It's even more important because our Department of Health has only 350 fewer employees than it did in 2008. And while they may have the staff to stay ahead of tracing, we know they aren't keeping up with the testing because it's taking 7 days or more in many communities to get results back. We can't afford to have the spread. And we can't assume that it's health versus the economy, because there is no economy if we don't have health. So I absolutely believe we need to have a mask mandate, and I'd be happy to hand or send a mask to anyone who doesn't have one.
Lieutenant Governor?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think there's unity here on this issue around face masks. It's has to be mandated. Part of the question was about enforcement, and I think that's a good question. The critical piece around enforcement is that our public safety officers could actually have masks in their vehicles and give them out to people as part of the way to remind people that they need to wear them. Enforcement doesn't always have to be punishment. I do think our business owners, I've been hearing many of them call out for the ask for mandatory face masks. It puts the business owners and their employees in an incredibly compromised position where they're struggling economically, but then have to ask a customer to please wear a mask, and that customer may choose to then not be a patron in their business, not buy something that they desperately need. So they're trying to protect their employees, but they also need the business. And then there are patrons who come in and sometimes when asked to do so, will actually spit on the employee or will be aggressive and angry at an employee. And if you're a struggling minimum wage worker behind the counter, you shouldn't be in the position to have to ask a customer to wear a mask. So if the governor would lead, as now some other Republican governors around the country are starting to talk about mandatory masks, and say, this is what we need to do. You have to wear a mask. Our tourists and visitors would have a clear message from our government that in Vermont, you wear a mask. That would help our businesses. That would help us stay healthier. That would help us stay safer. So it's, as was earlier said, it's about our health and our economy, and we have to mandate masks, and we have to make masks fully available to everyone and anyone who wants one. And that's another aspect of where government can help. Yes, there's many wonderful people. I know Rebecca just spoke of it. We've handed out masks as well. Our campaign has masks. If anybody wants one, you can go to zuckermanforvt.com and get a Zuckerman for Vermont face mask. But it's really important that we know that not everyone has access to them. Many people are struggling economically, and even though a mask may seem like a small expense, they're struggling to put food on the table. They may also make that choice. So I think we have to make them mandatory and available from government.
Mr. Winburn?
Yes, I think we have to make them mandatory. And I think that Governor Cuomo from New York State has done a really good job of recognizing the threat early on and in the beginning and shutting things down. I think that they have a lesser problem, especially for a big state, than a lot of the other states across the country. And I saw in the news today, and seen it recently too, that there are a lot of great strides being made to create a vaccine for coronavirus. And I think that once that there is a vaccine, then it needs to be free, and it should be freely available. And it's something that the government needs to get behind because of the public safety and public health implications. It's not always easy, but I think that the time will come when all of this ends. But until then, yes, we need to mandate masks.
Mr. Winburn, I'll go to you first on this one. What are your thoughts on reparations for African Americans?
Well, there's been a lot of controversy on reparations, and I personally, I'm not sure that that will work. I'd be happy to study it and to talk to people about that. But race relations are really depend on human connections and human contact, and we all need to be more fair about our views of the past, and to know that devastating mistakes, and the slavery is intolerable. Slavery was here in the United States, but also all over the world in ancient times. Back in the 18th century, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the slaves. And I think we've had an African American president, which is a step forward. And I think that Joe Biden, if he's going to be our candidate, I'd prefer to have Bernie Sanders, but I think Joe Biden should pick a woman of color to be his vice president.
Lieutenant Governor?
Yeah, thank you. There's a bill in the legislature, H478, that would establish a panel to really look into reparations, whether to do them, how to do them. And I would say we have to put that legislation into action and then follow those recommendations once that research has been done with multiple important different people at the table, again, to figure out what's the best way to do this. We have to recognize that 400 years of white supremacy, from slavery through the 13th Amendment of the Constitution to the GI Bill and redlining and various policies, including the war on drugs, have all put our communities of color at an economic disadvantage that is mounted to the point where communities of color have 1/10 the family wealth that white people have in this country. And that's why the topic of reparations has to be discussed. This country's economy was built on the back of Black and brown people in this country. And if we don't address that, look inward at ourselves to the benefits that we have had as white people from that history, and then work to address it to make sure all people in this country have an economic opportunity to move forward in a positive way with that possibility of reparations, then we aren't really doing our job to address the racism that exists in our country and the economic disparity that exists because of that racism.
Ms. Holcomb?
So consider these two statistics. In Vermont, if you're a white household, 70% of white households own their own homes. Only about 22% of Black households own their homes. And when you think of the role of home ownership in helping families build assets over the last century, that has profound implications. And it has its roots in two primary causes, both of which are very real and have profoundly affected opportunity. One is discrimination in mortgage markets. It was much harder for African Americans to get access to the mortgage markets. And the other was just plain discrimination in deeds. In fact, there are many deeds in Vermont that had provisions in them that precluded or said it was against the law to sell that particular piece of property to a Black family. And so because they were excluded by discrimination, they lost one of the most important opportunities for many families to build assets in ways that would have made people resilient. The problem is because there's such a difference in how people live right now, that's a legacy of past discrimination, laws that seem fair on their face are not fair. Because if we currently reward people who have mortgages by accounting for that in our tax code, we are exacerbating the very inequality that we think we're trying to address. So we need to be systematically looking across all aspects of state government at ways in which even perhaps we weren't thinking about it, but we're actually making inequality worse. And that to me is what reparations are about. It's about making sure everybody has a fair chance. And it's still a current problem. Recently, we found out that when the PPP came out from the federal government, there was a rush to push it out quickly, which makes sense. But the challenge is that the people who were best able to take advantage of it were people who already had established lines of credit. And many of our minority-owned businesses and our women-owned businesses didn't have that same established line of credit, or they were newer businesses. And so when the PPP came out, many of those businesses didn't have access to it in the same way that other businesses might have. So the legislature did a good thing in that it held aside some of the recent CARES Act aid to specifically address needs of women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses that might have missed out on that first round of aid. And what we saw is that the aid for the woman-owned business was distributed relatively quickly. But the problem is, if the same people are distributing the aid as didn't do it well the last time, the probability is it's hard to do it again. And so what we saw is that there's still aid available for minority-owned businesses that hasn't been dispersed. What we need to be doing as a state is working ahead of time to make sure our laws are equitable. We need to plan relief aid with equity for Black and brown Vermonters in mind, so that we have access to the communities in ways that help connect people to the resources when they're available. Or what we think of as aid may actually end up exacerbating inequity. And as governor, that's what I'll make my first priority, because I know that equity is always easier to achieve if you plan it up front than it is if you try to correct it after the fact.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Holcomb first on this one. In your opinion, what are the top 3 challenges faced by the state of Vermont today?
Right now, we actually have 4. We have a health crisis, which is crowding out opportunity and making people unsafe. We have an economic crisis that's going to require us to make significant infrastructure investments and also diversify our economy. We have an environmental crisis, and our economic solution will be in part an environmental solution as well. And we have a social justice crisis. And those are the 4 crises that will be my priority as I figure out how to get the state back on its feet.
Mr. Winburn?
Well, I think we have an economic crisis, we have a social justice crisis, and we also have a pollution crisis. Here in Bennington, we've had problems with the Teflon plant and polluting the streams and rivers and waters in North Bennington and parts of Bennington. I have PFOAs in my well in my backyard. I don't think anybody in the area wants that. And I think that we're making some good strides in keeping the big corporations that cause these problems and hold them responsible by bringing them to court and getting justice. And but those are the ones that I would see to be the top three.
Lieutenant Governor?
Thank you. I think there's umbrellas like the economic situation for folks, which is housing, jobs, and keeping businesses open so they can have those jobs for workers. And that includes wages. Then we have the racial justice and injustice issues that are systemic throughout our society. We were just talking about reparations. We've talked about criminal justice issues. We've talked about economic opportunity, banking, and so forth. And then the last is our environment as a whole, the climate crisis, but also water. You know, if we were to work towards regenerative agriculture, we would actually be investing in our rural economy, helping farms build soil while taking carbon out of the air. And we would be helping with water quality, because as you build organic matter in your soil, it can absorb more of the rains and run off less of the water pollution from farms or other from the intense rains. So all of those issues, the economy, racial justice issues, and the climate/environment would be the three.
Very good. Lieutenant Governor, I'll have you go first on this one. How would you have handled the COVID-19 situation differently than Governor Douglas?
Yeah, I've talked with Speaker Johnson and President Pro Tim Ash, and they've talked about the fact that they met with the governor in late February and said, you've got to set up the unemployment system for the wave that's going to come. And one of the others talked about the issues of how it was dealt with in Rhode Island. There was no forethought about the wave that was going to happen. And it wasn't until I sent a letter to the governor's office to the Commissioner of Labor that then 2 days later, money was distributed. But it was a month after this all started. So that's a big one. I do also think the governor deserves good accolades for acting quickly to shut things down and close things down. We've seen in other states where that didn't happen, the rates of infection have gone through the roof, and unfortunately, we are still suffering with this all across the country. So he does deserve some accolades for that. But also with respect to schools and child care centers, there was very little warning or guidance given. There was a lot of question for a week or two about what's going to happen, and then suddenly they were closed on very short notice, giving our teachers and child educators very little notice to do the job right. So I would say those are some of the big issues. And then ultimately, the governor really on the mask issue at this point has really not moved in the right direction. And I think there's a big reason for that, and that is that he's trying to walk a fine line between keeping some of that more ideological right-wing base that's really taken over the Republican Party in Vermont on his side through the primary with a strong opponent in the primary. And I suspect after the primary, unless there's enough pressure beforehand, we will see him go to a mandatory mask situation. But he's trying to walk a political line when really health should come first.
Mr. Winburn?
Well, people see Governor Scott on TV 3 times a week around lunchtime, giving speeches and talking about the coronavirus. And he's done a reasonable job. But I think that Governor Cuomo in New York State has done a better job. But I think it really points out is that Phil Scott's a Trump Republican. He's carrying out the same policies that the Trump administration is carrying out. He talks a good talk, but when it comes down to it, he does exactly what Donald Trump wants all the Republican governors to do. And if you look at the policies that he has opposed, he's vetoed just about everything. I mean, he may have done a reasonable job with the coronavirus so far, and maybe, there are other steps that he should be taking, but he's vetoed family leave. He's vetoed $15 minimum wage. He's really done absolutely nothing about the opioid crisis, and he's carrying on the same talking points and the same policies as President Trump.
I'm ready to go.
Yeah, I'm muted. Sorry. Go ahead.
That's all right. Yeah. No, I just want to acknowledge what my two colleagues have said. And I know that Governor Abbott of Texas is the head of the RGA, and despite his claim he's not campaigning, we do know that Phil Scott is having the RGA already spend money, especially on social media, on his behalf. And I suspect that maybe one of the conditions, as David said, was, he has to be careful there as well. Same as he has to be careful on voting. I mean, he did not do anything to help. And in fact, he forced the legislature to spend time, right as they were trying to push out aid, dealing with vote by mail. It makes no sense to force people to choose between their public health and voting. And I really regret Governor Scott wasted the legislature's time at a critical time to do that. There are many issues here. And, back in February, we saw what was happening in other states. We knew we were headed towards a shutdown of some kind. It's why when he first started talking about state of emergency, I put out guidelines for schools and also for emergency child cares if we needed to have them in terms of public safety, because it was inevitable that they were going to shut down and there had been no acknowledgement. And we absolutely needed to make sure that educators had an opportunity to prepare. And I could give you a very long laundry list of things I would have done, but I'll highlight just a couple because I think they're really important. We know that schools needed to go online, and I think that was the right thing to do. But we also know that we are now asking schools to reopen. And there are several things that have not been done and have not been tested to make sure that they're robust enough to handle a reopening of schools in every part of the state and child cares in every part of the state. We don't know if the Department of Health has capacity to quickly test, track, and trace in every community if we have multiple possible simultaneous outbreaks in different communities as schools and child cares begin to reopen. And again, if they have 350 fewer staff than they did, how do we know? And if they're planning to repurpose their existing staff, what are they giving up to be able to focus on coronavirus that might leave us vulnerable to other public health challenges? We need to know this, particularly as we ask our educators to put themselves on the front line. We see already from Texas that when child cares open up, of the cases that were reported that were directly traced back to child care, 70% of them affected the adults, the employees in the building. And as we ask our teachers to go into this situation, they need to know that we have really planned to do everything we can to mitigate risk. I talked to a superintendent who said the ultimate public trust is being in education, because you take what parents love the most, their children, and you take our staff and you're putting them in harm's way right now. And we need to not do that. And we need to be standing by them as we do. We also know that this is not the time to force cuts in school budgets, because across the state, schools are having to plan and find new capacity to support children as they potentially reopen. They have to plan not just for a full opening, which I think is unlikely, but they need to be able to plan for being fully virtual when we know that 30 to 40% of Vermont households don't have access to sufficient broadband to be able to do education online. And they need to plan for a mixed opening. And what was concerning is that guidance only came out a couple days ago. And if you actually read the guidance and the CDC guidance, it cannot be done. So we are not still in the realistic zone for opening up in consistent ways that are consistent with CDC guidance. And when we ask Vermonters to take this step, we need to ask and understand what we're asking our educators and our classes to do. And I could go on, but I'm going to stop there. But this is a very important topic, and there are many places he has not done what he needs to do.
I got to everyone on that, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. I was. Well, this question rolls right from where you just left off, Rebecca. What would your policy/strategy for opening schools be for this upcoming academic year? And I'll let Ms. Holcomb continue.
Well, since I went a little long, I'll try to go short here. I would tell our schools to plan to open in person, but I'd also tell them to plan to be entirely virtual. And I'd also tell them to plan to be having opening in a mixed or a variegated way, and to be prepared to pivot between all three at different points in the year. I would also encourage them for the youngest children to focus on getting the youngest children back in person to the extent possible, including perhaps using a space for older kids to make sure younger kids get back. That's because parents can't work and take care of their kids at the same time. We know the youngest kids are the least likely to spread the disease, and we know that they're the ones who suffer the most if they miss schooling. So that's why we need to prioritize in-person learning for our youngest kids. For our oldest kids, we can do more online, but what we need to do is find developmentally appropriate ways to keep them connected and engaged socially. And I put out some guidance on my website. People can see those recommendations, and we'll have more out in a couple days. If people want to follow, RebeccaHolcomb.com.
Lieutenant Governor?
Well, thank you. First, I know that we all want life to return to normal, which would include everybody going back to school and everybody being able to just have normal relations with folks. But that is unfortunately not a reality until a vaccine comes out. We did get some great news today, as Pat talked about earlier, with some early trials in England on a vaccine. So I think we're all very excited and hoping that those next round of trials continue to go well so that maybe we can have a vaccine that we can all have and move ourselves towards a healthier normal in order to return to school without all the parameters. But we know that's probably not going to happen before the school year starts. I think the former secretary brought up a lot of great issues in terms of multiple different plans that schools need to have. But I think it's really important to recognize, especially in some of the smaller districts and smaller schools, that it's really hard to plan for all of those different issues without much clearer guidelines from the state on how to do that and what kind of support from the state to do that. We need to be looking at the custodial services. What resources do they need to increase their ability to clean the schools? We need to be looking at whether or not we can retrofit faucets and fixtures in schools so that people aren't touching all those same surfaces. We need to be looking at what resources are necessary for teachers to be able to teach in hybrid models or in half classrooms, but then for what, twice the amount of time? That's not going to work. You know, the governor moved to actually cut education funding to the point that we would almost lose up to 2,000 teachers and educators in our state. We can't do that. We obviously continue, as we said earlier, we must implement mandatory masks. If we have masks across the state, we will reduce the risk of someone getting sick. And we have to make sure there's statewide protocols that if a child ends up coming down with the virus, that there's clear protocols for the schools on what to do with anybody that child was exposed to, or what should that local school do. So there's a number of set parameters, including what's the opening date for all schools to be ready for, so that everyone's ready to open safely. And what about workers' compensation for teachers who have symptoms, or educators, or who test positive for COVID-19? We need to address that. I'm hearing from constituents concerned that as educators, they're not as eligible for workers' comp with regard to this. And this is something that the governor can do on day one, because it was put in the legislation around workers' comp and COVID-19 that the governor can add different workplace sectors. We need to add that in right away. So these are a number of different issues. There's more, but we know we all want to. We want to for the economy. We want to for normalcy, but we need to plan accordingly, both at the local and state level.
Wyburn?
Well, we need to protect our teachers, and we need to protect our children, and we need to protect our staff. I think we need to take a pause until the vaccine is perfected and that people are vaccinated. I think that it poses a terrible risk of danger and death to our children and our school system and our teachers and staff. That's one of the reasons that I believe that healthcare is not only a right, but it's our moral responsibility. Healthcare for all is something that we all need in Vermont, and it's something that will take care of our teachers and our children, and will help to equalize the playing field for everybody. You can't have people who are making the choice of whether or not to pay for their doctor or pay their taxes or pay for food. That's immoral. And we need to have what Bernie Sanders has proposed and what Biden will probably perfect is Obamacare. But healthcare for all is our moral responsibility, and I believe that that's something that that will be enacted in the near future.
Here's a good one. whoever wins, how would you make use of your opponents in this race? Each of you has so much to offer the well-being of Vermont. If you are elected, how would you ask your opponents in this race to assist your administration in being successful? Mr. Winburn?
Well, Rebecca's expertise is obviously in education, and there have been some problems with, making, sort of consolidating the school system. But I think overall, she's done a good job, and she's done things that are in the interest of the state. Although I think that some of it needs to be paused at this point. And David, seems to have a touch for agriculture. He's a farmer and has been a farmer for a long time. And I think the agricultural community has respect for him. And, I think that he has a lot of good ideas when it comes to agriculture.
Lieutenant Governor?
Well, thank you. I think there's really two rounds of winning. One of us will continue on in the general election to try to beat Phil Scott. And I would certainly want the help of both of these folks to beat Phil Scott. I think we all in common have that goal, and I would offer my help to each of them. If one of them wins and I don't, to organize around the state, increase voter turnout, and make sure we really focus on these issues of the economy, working Vermonters who are struggling, our climate, opening our schools, in whatever way that either of the two of them would want my help in beating Phil Scott, which is the first goal, because we've got a great legislature. They've done a lot of work. Earlier, we talked about the benefits cliff. I know Michael Sirotkin, chair of the Economic Development Committee, has been working on that for years. It is not as easy a fix as was maybe portrayed earlier with just leadership. It's actually an extremely difficult job. So I would work with both of these colleagues to help develop policies and organize so that we can beat Phil Scott in November. And I say we, it's whichever one of us wins. Then certainly I would welcome each of their expertise. Pat Winburn has been an incredibly successful lawyer. He understands class action issues, as well as he said, to work with legal aid when he started. We have a great legal aid program, but we obviously need to continue to expand on that. We put, I believe, over $500,000 of CARES Act funding into legal aid for housing protection for renters and so forth. But bringing smart legal help from all corners of the state would be very helpful. And Rebecca's education experience is certainly top notch. Taught for, I believe, a couple decades, incredible teacher. I've heard from former students of hers who really enjoyed her teaching and would welcome her experience heading the Department of Education in ways that it worked, in ways that it didn't, so that we can continue to learn moving forward to improve education, including looking at ideas like maybe even this fall doing more experiential education outdoors, maybe for the first month of, which is, this is an idea for this fall, but we need to look at rejiggering education to really make sure it suits the times of today and not the testing protocols of the Bush administrations and so forth. And I think she knows a whole lot more about that than I do, and I would welcome all that kind of information and knowledge.
David, I got my start in experiential education, but you also know some of the best learning I've seen has been on the farm. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
It's all good.
So I think we're all saying the same thing, and I would say agree with everything that came before. And I just want to underscore the primary goal here. First and foremost is to make sure we get as many people to show up in November to vote and to vote blue. We need to have a Democrat win, and I will absolutely work with anyone here, and I will make sure we take advantage of everybody here, and I will help everybody here make that change, because we need to win, because right now we have leadership, we have the wrong people in place making the wrong decisions for the wrong reasons. And Vermont has too much at stake right now, and we can't wait. And so we all know we're going to work together to get that done. David, you've got incredible experience, particularly in organizing. My hat is off to you. You're great at that, and I have so much to learn from you. And you've been a strong and passionate advocate for many years around many issues that are important to me as well. And Pat, I love the fact that you're proud and committed to many of the cases and the people that you've served and the principles of justice. But I also know that between the three of us, we represent three different parts of the state. Dave, you're up in Chittenden County. Pat, you're down on the south border, and I'm over on the eastern side. And what this represents is that we're all going to work together from no matter where we come to make the change that Vermont needs.
Thank you. Let's go to Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman for this one. What will you do to ensure that Vermonters, especially Vermonters in rural areas, have better access to the internet for remote work, distance learning, and all-around safety?
Well, thank you. I've been talking about this issue for a number of years, and one thing I've learned in the legislature, when I was in the House and in the Senate, was sometimes when you're ahead of the curve on issues, it takes a while to get it done. And I know we're all very frustrated that broadband has not been addressed as quickly as we would want. The fundamental there is it takes money. As one of the few politically elected folks in the state who's regularly been willing to talk about more resources, particularly from those who are at the top end of the economic spectrum, to invest in Vermont. That is what I introduced a couple of years ago with the Green Mountain New Deal, where we would take some of the Trump tax cuts that primarily went to the wealthiest Vermonters. If we were to sequester half of those and say, let's put $100 million a year into issues like broadband, affordable housing, weatherization, small-scale renewable energy, particularly weatherization and renewable energy on low-income and fixed-income Vermonters' homes, we would not only work to solve the climate crisis, but we would create jobs. Again, if $20 million a year of that $100 million was put into broadband to leverage federal funds and private funds, we would have already, and we will need to do going forward, a far more robust broadband system throughout this state. We know, as we talked about at the opening, that the southern part of the state has really struggled economically and with population. It's been some of the hardest hit with population decline. If we have good broadband and affordable housing in the rural parts of particularly southern Vermont and up into the Northeast Kingdom, then we will have better educational opportunities, better economic opportunities, and a better climate footprint. And that's going to attract people to southern Vermont and to our rural areas so that they can live and thrive in a beautiful, healthy place, as long as they're doing it in a wonderfully inclusionary way.
Ms. Holcomb?
This is one of those issues, we just got to get it done. And when I was Secretary of Education, we were the only state that administered our state assessment, which is mandated both in state law and federal law, online. And we made a decision to do it that way because we knew if we required that it be administered online, it would make it possible for our school districts to access federal dollars to support pushing relatively high-speed internet to every school building. And our logic was if we could get it to schools, it was that much closer to people's front doors. This is an issue we have to deal with. But I learned a couple things when we were trying to figure out how to get broadband to schools. And I'm glad we got it as many places as we did, because I've seen teachers sitting in the parking lot of their schools delivering lessons to students over the school's wireless during this shutdown. I know that that right now we actually have fiber at most addresses. It's just not through the telecoms. It's through the utilities. And there is a tremendous opportunity to set up public-private partnerships that allow our public utility companies to use the fiber that's already wrapped around our power lines to push broadband out in some kind of partnership. It's a regulatory challenge, but there are models for doing it, and I think we can get it done. It's a faster, more efficient way to get it done. The other thing that's very promising, and I see this on my side of the state, which is more rural, are these communication unions districts, which allow municipalities, which can be composed of multiple towns, to bond in the municipal bond markets, where money is much cheaper. And it allows people to work together as communities in ways that create public options. Because one of the things that we saw after the last recession is we just assumed that if you dropped $150 million on a company, that it would put broadband out in rural areas, and it didn't. So we have one community that has Silicon Valley grade internet and many, many communities that have none. We just need to understand that there's a strong role for government, and if you throw money out without regulating it or contracting for it appropriately, you might get nothing for it. And as your governor, I'll make sure that when we spend dollars, we get value for Vermonters.
Swinburne?
Well, we need better broadband in Vermont. The Northeast Kingdom has a serious problem with their internet access. and portions of Bennington County do as well. I think some people are happy with their internet providers, but for the people that don't have any, it's almost like you have two Vermonts. You have a Vermont that lives in the past without any sort of access from a school standpoint and a workplace standpoint, and you have the people that the haves and the have-nots. So we need everybody needs to be a have in Vermont, and I think to the extent that people don't have internet access and people aren't their providers aren't providing the service, we need to subsidize that. The state needs to pay for that to get everything up and running. Children in Bennington should have the same education that the children in Chittenden County and Burlington and Winooski and everywhere all over the state have. And I think it's an important problem that has to be solved. But I think it's one that's really easily fixable through a source of both state and federal funds.
Thank you. This is a quick one. I'll just run right down the aisle. It's yes or no. Family medical leave, livable wage, single payer health care. Lieutenant Governor.
Yes, and yes, particularly with primary care first.
Mr. Winburn.
Yes, and yes.
And Ms. Holcomb.
Yes, on all of them. I think we would probably have some differences about how we get there, but we absolutely need to see those as priorities.
Thank you. Next question is, we know that there is an issue with implicit bias in policing. What will you do as governor to address this? And I'll ask Mr. Winburn. Why don't you go first?
Well, there is implicit bias in policing, but I think most cops are good. I think that there are some bad cops, and we need to deal with them. But the police, really, the state only has funds the state police. We don't fund the local municipalities. I'm the moderator of the Village of Old Bennington, and I'm a past trustee. And I know that the people that are listening to this that are on the select board and other local towns and municipalities realize that it's really more of a lack of education and training. That's where the money ought to be spent. I am concerned that our police departments are becoming more militarized by the equipment that the federal government gives them and provides for them. And I think that we need to have less militarization and more social work. I think some of the things that the cops do really aren't jobs for the police. It's really a job for social workers and for people that want to really just listen and try to help and to prevent problems from happening. And, I think that even in the schools, we should have embedded social workers in the schools so that, everybody is treated decently and fairly, but also in a rational and in a compassionate way.
Lieutenant Governor.
Well, thank you. We've had in the legislature for years now implicit bias training. Boer Yang is an incredibly articulate, smart, and gives a really good presentation. That actually has to happen not just in law enforcement, but across all of state government. As we're dealing with white supremacy and becoming more aware of all of our implicit bias, it's not just an issue in our law enforcement. And if we address it across the whole society, that's what's going to start to make our society healthier and stronger and more inclusive. With respect to law enforcement, the Senate and the House passed S-219 this year to also look at shifting who's on the Criminal Justice Training Council to make sure there's a much wider representation, not just law enforcement, but people from different sectors of our society, so that the training that law enforcement gets isn't primarily focused on incarceration and 60 hours of firearms training, while only 4 or 5 hours of community building, but in fact has bias training, has community training, and we need to look at whether or not the amount of resources we put towards law enforcement some of those could be shifted towards other community services that could actually be safer and healthier ways to de-escalate situations, whether it's mental health counselors that go with our law enforcement, which was also passed this year in the legislature, or whether it's investments, as we talked earlier, in our Black and brown community businesses, as well as many low-income communities, because our biases are primarily against the BIPOC community, but also we have economic biases, and we incarcerate poor people way more than we do those who are wealthy and can afford lawyers. And again, back to Pat working for Legal Aid early on, he knows this better than any of us, that low-income folks do not get a fair shake in our criminal justice system. So there's a range of issues with respect to implicit bias as just a tip of the iceberg in terms of how we need to reform public safety issues.
Welcome.
So I think this really speaks to some larger cultural changes that we've been going through since, I would say, 1980. And one has been to systematically defund public services and institutions that help people be healthy and help people have opportunity. And in response, when people have unmet needs, to treat them punitively. And so if you look at Vermont, what we have is broken mental health nets. I mean, we've never really asked, have we funded our state mental health system for the job we're asking it to do? We don't have consistent access to healthcare, so that people who are struggling with addiction don't get the health treatment they need sometimes to be able to be safe and be healthy. And as a result, we've set up a system where those problems and the challenges that people are feeling fall back on the few institutions that are still standing. One of them is public schools. And one of the reasons our school budgets are rising is because we're the payer of last resort in education. But it's also happening in our police system. And police have implicit bias, but they are also dealing with problems that they're not trained or equipped to deal with. And you've struggled this with in Bennington as well, but we've also struggled with it in other communities. And there was a report recently, an independent report, that talked about a warlike mentality. And that's what we need to confront. What we need to think about is how, as a state and as communities, we're investing in helping people be strong rather than making them suffer and then coming in punitively after the fact and seeing them as opposition. That's what we have to unpack. And a huge piece of it is racism, and implicit bias has to be part of our training, but it also has to be addressed robustly and systematically so that there's actually accountability for making the change that we need to make. I believe we need more community review panels. And I believe when community review panels are established, they need to reflect the communities that they serve. And when they make recommendations, there needs to be some accountability for follow through on those recommendations. I think we need a statewide standard of force, and the legislature made great progress this year on that. But we also need to be prepared to say as a state, if we see abuses of force, we're actually not going to fund it because that's unacceptable in our society. So I think that they're powerful conversations that we have to build on strong processes, but also to hold ourselves accountable for making sure that public safety is safe for the whole public, and especially for marginalized and historically disadvantaged communities. I think you're on mute, Tom.
I muted myself instead of unmuting. We look to have about 8 minutes left. Would the candidates rather take one more question, or would you like to do closing statements?
Whatever you want.
Whatever I want. Well,
I
I would
Also fine, Tom. I mean, we've been talking at your crowd, but it's also wonderful if you want to take a couple minutes for people in your community to tell us what they're thinking about.
Yeah.
That's a big can of worms we could open up if you.
You're the moderator.
We have 8 minutes. I think I'll just go with one more question. What will you do to expand equities and protections for people with disabilities? Lieutenant Governor.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Well, one of the things I did when I first became lieutenant governor was I went to a lieutenant governor's meeting, and one of my colleagues had their business card with Braille. And it blew my mind that I had not thought of that, and that many people I know have never thought of that as a way to make government accessible to a segment of the community. And frankly, most businesses don't make themselves accessible to a segment of the community without having Braille on their cards. And I've added that to my card from day one before I even got sworn into office. And I think thinking about each and every one of these aspects, just as we're doing with the racial injustices that are going on, is we all need to be exploring how do we walk through the world? And even walking is an issue that some people can't do. But how do we get through the world in ways that sometimes other folks can't because of either mental or physical disabilities? And so it's important that we explore those and we include them in the conversation. One of the things that I've done as Lieutenant Governor is start a movie series once a month to talk about provocative issues. And one of the movies I showed, and it was actually, I showed it in Manchester down in your county, as well as up at the State House, was Intelligent Lives. And it was about education systems, as well as economic opportunities, and young folks with different challenges growing up and trying to thrive in our society. And then we had a community discussion about that movie. And we had members of the community speak about their experiences. And so part of governing in a way that's inclusive is including people from these different marginalized communities. And we need to be looking at that up and down throughout state government, just as we are our racial injustice and inequities that have gone on for centuries.
Mr. Wimber.
Well, the Americans for Disabilities Act was passed back in the 1970s, and it was meant to protect people who have disabilities, who have problems with walking and other things. And, you know, I think that was a good federal act, and I think that it's done a good job in helping handicapped people with handicap spaces and having places be accessible. But I've also represented the disabled. I've represented, you know, children with autism, with different kinds of disabilities, and we've enforced their rights through the legal system and through the court system. I've tried over 75 jury trials in the courts of the state of Vermont, and I know firsthand how people have been affected who are disabled and who have problems with disabilities. And I think that I would be a compassionate governor and try to do the best I could to help the disabled in Vermont.
Right. Sultan, did I?
This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, in part because of members of my own family, and in part because of my experience as a school teacher. And I could tell you many powerful stories of why I believe we need to plan in all services with access and inclusion in mind, and why it's the right thing to do, but it's also better for all of us. But I'll talk to you about a very hard experience I had as Secretary of Education, and that's very controversial. And that is that in our state, we have many communities that don't have schools. And so they pay tuition, they pay vouchers to other schools nearby to serve their kids. And I spoke to somebody who'd grown up in a community, and he'd been, you know, with the same kids in the class in a small elementary school for 8 years. And as they went off to high school, he was not allowed to go to the school that his closest friends went to because they did not serve kids with disabilities. And that really bothered me. And it bothered me because we have a situation where because of his disability, he does not have the same choices. And we have set up a system where tax dollars follow kids to environments that won't open their doors to all kids in that community. So this child had spent 8 years with his friends, and then he had to separate because of his disability. And as Secretary of Education, I really don't believe that we should be putting walls between children and institutions that are publicly funded. It was a very controversial issue, and I know it's one that people feel very strongly about. But when children want to do their best, and they want to attend an environment, and they want to be with the people who are their community and who they've gone to school with for 8 years, I think we need policy that needs to support them and be inclusive of them.
Very good. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you. I can say that I'm looking forward to working with whoever wins the primary to make, I would have no issue with working with any of the three of you. in making sure we take back the governor's office this fall. I think you'd all make fine governors. So we need to do that. We also need to retake the White House. One of the questions I did not ask you is in the unlikely event that you are elected and Trump reelected, how would you deal with that? Hopefully that's something we never ever have to think of. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a great night.
Well, thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you everybody for coming up, and please be sure to show up on August 11th and show up also in November. Thank you, everybody.
And vote early.
Yeah, you can vote any day now.
Take care.
Thanks.